There was this guy, he was shipwrecked on a deserted island. He was actually there for a really long time. He was there for 15 years. And the win for him was he happened to be incredibly handy. At this point, you heard me last week, you're like, is this a joke or is this real? You're just going to have to wait and find out. He was incredibly handy, and so he was able to build himself a house. He constructed him, not even just a house, but he made multiple structures. And it took 15 years for these fishermen to just kind of happen upon him. And when they got there, they were amazed. Right, they were just like, man, this is the house that you live in is nicer than our house back home. You are incredible. Would you mind, just real quick, would you give us a tour of this town that you have built before we all leave? And he was more than happy to do it. And so he showed them around. He's like, hey, this is the grocery store. This is where you figure out it's a joke. This is the grocery store where I get my food. This is the bank where I keep all of my money. He goes, this is the library where I get all of my books. These are the buildings that I have built for myself. And they were amazed. But then they realized, they were like, hey, hold on, there's 2 buildings left. What are those? You didn't mention them. And he points at one of them, and he says, well, that's my church. That's where I worship on Sunday mornings. And that other building, that's where I used to go to church. And it's a silly, silly image, but it brings up a really big point that when it comes to conflict, things get weird. When it comes to conflict, we don't always know what to do. And here's the problem. As we do life together with people, the longer we're together, the more likely we are to rub each other the wrong way. The more likely you are to grind my gears a little bit. Think about it. The person that you talk to, hang out with, love the most is probably a person that you have had the most conflict with. Why? Because conflict is a symptom of relationship in a fallen world. Conflict is going to happen. It's not a question of whether or not it occurs. The question is, when conflict comes in, how do we respond? And I'd say the even bigger question is, do you fight the same way that the world fights? Do you fight in a way that represents the pull and the current of this world? Or do you fight in a way that looks different, that looks like it's from somewhere else because it's modeling a creator who you were designed to look like? And what we need to know, what we need to take away from that is, as a church, we need to be committed to fighting for relationship, not in relationship. We need to be committed to stepping into and engaging in the battle, but not for the sake of winning or dominating that other person, but to actually say, hey, I want to pursue unity. I want to pursue reconciliation. I want to pursue growth. I want to pursue maturity. And sometimes, in fact, always, that looks like looking like Jesus. What would it look like if you and I took that seriously? Because I would say that as a church, and I'm not talking 180 Life, I'm talking Big C Church, when it comes to conflict, this is an area that we could probably stand to do better. What would be different? If you have your Bibles, I want to invite you to open up to Matthew chapter 7, where we're really going to kind of unpack this idea of pressing into conflict in a biblical way. While you get there, I'm Josh. I'm the lead pastor here at 180 Life Church, and I am losing my voice. So halfway through this message, we're just going to see what happens. But we are going to press in, and we have continued to press in to a series called Get in the Game, right? It's this series where we're taking seriously the call that Jesus has placed on our lives, not just to observe what he has done, not just to sit back and relax and watch other people carry the mission forward, but to get on the field ourselves and to run the plays for Team Jesus. He doesn't want us to be observers. He wants us to be players on the field. And when it comes to conflict, so often we just don't know what to do. We might have, as we get ready to jump into Matthew chapter 7, we might have a perspective on really the book of Acts that might be a little bit skewed. Because some of us might be like, yeah, man, if we were just like them, we wouldn't have conflict. If we were that full of the Holy Spirit, if we were that fresh from the rising of Jesus, if we were that close to the situation, we wouldn't have conflict either. But listen, conflict is not a since Jesus thing. Conflict's been going on since the fall. And even in the book of Acts, if you open it up through the lens of conflict, you're going to see conflict all over the place, especially among people in the same team. All right, we see Paul and Peter who have this dialogue, this public interaction where Peter's it's like this middle school interaction, they're at the lunch table and Peter's eating with the Jews. And Paul's like, what about the Gentiles, man? And they're in this battle where he's like, hey, like you've forgotten about, like it's not just about the cool kids. It's not just about how you're viewed, but actually it's supposed to be about all of us. What is going on? Paul had a conflict with Barnabas over John Mark, where they actually separated paths for a season. Paul, if you look at any of his epistles, usually he's addressing a conflict that is existing within the church. Conflict is a biblical principle that we're actually meant to press into, and it's not about like being more like them. It's about pressing into Jesus and who he calls us to be. See, we are meant to be disciples who take conflict seriously. That's why our mission statement is what it is. We exist to make and send disciples who love and live like Jesus. Why? Because loving and living is hard. Loving and living is hard, especially because sometimes when we try to love and live like Jesus, life hits back. Relationships don't always lean the way that we were hoping to, and conflict is going to happen. And we have to figure out, what does it look like for me to stand firm in who Jesus tells me I am, and also who Jesus tells me they are? Because lies sneak in and we handle it the wrong way. Matthew chapter 7 starts like this. It says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." And this is one of the more misquoted passages in Scripture. Right? And we've got a lot of those. Facebook and Instagram has really affected it. This is on the more negative side, but we've got positive ones that we misquote all the time. I'm gonna give you one because I love ruining verses for you. Jeremiah 29:11. "For I have plans for you, to prosper you, not to harm you." And you're like, "Oh, put that on a mug." Right? And then we open up Jeremiah. We're like, what just happened? Because in that situation, Israel is straying and straying and straying. And God's like, all right, there's going to be some consequences. And so they start being taken into exile by the Babylonians. And they cry out to God and they go, "God, like, don't let this happen. Like, God, save us, help us to prosper." And God responds. He says, "I have plans for you. I have plans to prosper you and not to harm you. And my plans start with you going into exile right now. You're going to be there for a while. You should start building some homes." It means something different. And when we read this verse, a lot of times we will even quote this to ourselves. When we see conflict situations come up, where we see a brother or sister drifting, and we see them stepping into an unhealthy relationship, or we see them just kind of going the wrong way, and we say, "Hey, you know what? I would say something. I would engage in that hard conversation. I would step into that conflict, but judge not lest you be judged." Like, it's not my part to have that conversation. That's not what this is talking about. When we talk about healthy biblical accountability, the Bible is all about that. The Bible is all about us bearing each other up, holding the lines that we can look more and more like the Creator whose image we were made in. And part of that is being able to hold each other close, and when we start to drift, being able to pull each other back. Accountability, I would say, is the positive side of judgment. Now, there's another side to it, but accountability is not anti-biblical. In fact, it's one of the reasons that we have a board of directors that have authority over me. Right? Because I am not the exception. There needs to be accountability in my life. If you're trying to figure out, well, how would I contact them? You jump on our website. Their information is on there. Why? Because it's important. It's one of the reasons that our elders are actually, some of them are stepping onto our board of directors, because I need people in our context who are able to speak into my life and have authority. Why? Because accountability is good. Accountability is actually something that we should pursue because, one, it protects the church, and two, it helps protect my heart. As I look more like Jesus, as you look more like Jesus, accountability is a good thing. This is not to say, judge not lest you be judged. Don't judge, or you too will be judged. It's not saying, hey, don't have the biblical hard conversations. What it's talking about here is a puffed up pride where we point at someone and we gloat over how much better we are than them. Like, it's talking about, hey, like our job is not to make somebody look bad that we can feel better. Like, I've just got news for you. Like, Jesus didn't die so that bad people could be good. He died that dead people could become alive. Like, he died that we could be made in his image in the way that we were always designed to be. It's a process we're invited into. And the point isn't you being better than the person to your left or to your right. Because listen, sin is sin. If we stand in the presence of God, we need to be covered and clothed in righteousness. And the only way that happens is through Jesus. There is no one better than the other. We're meant to pursue this together. See, what this passage is really saying here is it's saying, do not judge unless you are prepared to be judged by the same standard. And he actually unpacks it a little bit more. He says, hey, listen, you're not meant to just point that finger and talk about how bad they are. We're actually meant to be pursuing holiness together. This is less about them and more about us. The goal is for us to be holy. We're going to manage it and walk through this conflict a little bit differently. We do this all the time where we actually kind of drag people through the mud. We do this even through like holy things, like testimonies. You ever do that? You ever see that? Where it's like, oh man, their testimony is gross. Like it's a mess. Like they were like, thank God, Lord, that I was never like them. Or we flip it and you have a story like mine, which is incredibly messy. And we go, look how boring their story is. And we forget that both stories were actually testimonies that were resources that God allowed us to have as we point to him and show the world. We got to stop the judgment. We got to stop puffing our chests out, and we got to actually step into community, which leads to accountability and leans away from a judgment that is about my pride. It continues, because I think Jesus isn't done. He wants us to understand it a little bit better. He says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Jesus puts the ownership exactly where we don't want it to be. Because he says, hey, you know what? Deal with yourself first. He gives us this order of kind of stepping into conflict. And he says, hey, listen, we get it out of order because what you want to do is you want to focus on them. He says, but before you do, we need to focus on ourselves. And so often we get caught up in this where we're so frustrated and angry. You ever, there are these times where some of us will get these emails. Or maybe it's like somebody hurt you, and so you just kind of like jump onto Facebook. You're like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to mess them up. And you write, like, you're not a wordsmith for a living, but you worded real hard here. And you sit down and you type it up, and you just rip this person to shreds. And you feel good at the end. Like, if you've ever done it, you're like, oh, I got him. Until you wake up the next morning. And you're like, what did I do? Because I looked nothing like Jesus in that moment. Why? Because we're constantly pulled into the current of this world. And Jesus is saying, listen, it's not that we ignore the issue. It's not that we don't have accountability. It's not that we don't press in. He's saying, but logs before specks. It's like, in order for me to be able to kind of press in with somebody, I need to see clearly. And a lot of times when I'm hurt people hurt people. And when I'm hurt, I see red. He says sometimes we need to slow down and make sure we address our part first. I think this is the stumbling block in a lot of marriages. Because we get in these marital disputes and we just want to duke it out. You know, because it's all about them and it's all about how they made you feel. And those weird things that they do that you were like, oh, it's so cute, I love it. Like now, like 7 years later, you're like, this is killing me inside. This has got to stop. If you want to know some of them, my wife, I'm sure she has an entire list for me. But the point is, like, we start grinding we start getting under each other's skin, and then it becomes not about handling the conflict, not about unity, not about fighting for relationship, but it's fighting in relationship because it's all his problem or it's all her problem. I cannot believe they made me feel this way. And Jesus is saying, no, you're missing it because you have a part. He's saying we need to focus on our part first. Jesus says, you hypocrite. You're so focused on how they made you feel that you're ignoring all the things that you are doing in the process. I have learned, the hard way, but I've learned the secret to winning every marital dispute. I'm serious. And because I love you, I'm going to share it with you. See, I found the secret to winning every marital dispute, and it looks like this. Be the first to sincerely seek forgiveness. That's it. And that word sincere is actually really important because if you're doing it just to like stop the argument and you don't actually mean what you're saying, or you're doing it to manipulate them into owning their part, you're missing it. It's not a transaction. The point is you clearing your side of the road. It's you looking at the log and being like, you know what, I can't even see clearly right now. And you look in the mirror and you take that log out and you say, please forgive me for what I have done. That's the secret. Here's when I've done that in my marriage. A couple crazy things happen. One, it diffuses the argument almost instantly. The second thing that happens is my bride, usually she'll own her part, and it's not why I did it, but she steps into it. And even as I was writing this, I was convicted because my wife has been kicking my butt at this lately. And I was like, man, like I'm writing this message, and I'm like, oh, I've been missing it. Why? Because we have a role. If we're mutually walking side by side, that's what a marriage is meant to look like, walking side by side towards the King. Well, part of it's going to be laying your life down and mutual submission happening and you being willing to own your part and be honest about what is going on. And the problem is, y'all, we can't get out of middle school, you know, because we get, but you started it. Like, why should I be the first to ask for forgiveness when you were the first to throw a punch? And we just get in these self-arguments. We're like, oh, man, I'm justified in the way that I'm acting, behaving, treating. And we don't do what we're meant to do because we're children. And listen, I say this because sometimes I'm a child. When conflict comes up, there's just something that happens. I don't care how old you are, you turn into a 12-year-old. It just happens. And that tension of you started it is exactly where we go. And Jesus says, no, if I fought the way that you fought, things would look a lot different. Like, see, the way that Jesus fought for us is he laid down his life for us. And that's what we're invited into. What would it look like if the way you fought didn't represent the world? What would it look like if the way you fought looked like owning your part, dealing with the log in your eye? Now, I do want to voice that not every situation has everybody being a participant. What I mean is, like, sometimes in conflict, you are a victim. Now, I would call that an outlier, but some of you have had things happen where you have had things done that were unwarranted, said that were not fair. Sometimes some of those things were evil. And here's what I would say. Like, I'm not putting the onus back on you on what happened. But even in situations where you're a victim, you do own how you respond. Like, we all have a part to play. Every relationship actually has three parts in every relationship, and here's what they are. There's God's part, and here's the beautiful thing about God's part, even though I try to play God sometimes, is God is always going to do his, and he's always going to do it better. Like, God has his part figured out. He doesn't need you, like, tinkering with it. He's got a plan. Might not look the way that you want, but God's got it covered. Now, your part, that's where I get frustrated. You know, because your part, I can't control. Your part, you're going to do you, and I can't really do anything about it. I cannot control you. Parents, that should be freeing for us because you can't control your kids. Like, you can set up boundaries, and you can lead them, and you can shepherd them. In fact, you should disciple them. We need to be intentional with our kids, and yet, at the end of the day, it's the whole problem with free will. We want no one else to have it but me. And they can control their part, and all we can do is set them up to make the wise choice. There should be freedom in that because the only part that you or I can truly control, and this is what Jesus is talking about logs and planks, is my part. Like, my part in every relationship, I have full control over. Now, I try to pretend like you made me do it. Like, obviously, like, I wouldn't have behaved that way if you didn't act that way towards me. And yet Jesus is like, no, you're missing it. There's a log in your eye. Look in the mirror, take it out. Like, you have full control. I have full control over my part, no matter what is going on around me. That's why in the middle of a storm, Jesus was able to remain asleep while everyone else panicked. Like, you have full control of your part, no matter what is going on around you. And this idea of owning your own part and dealing with planks and logs is actually a key core discipleship issue. Because I'll sit down with people as we're engaging in discipleship, and we'll talk about conflict, because conflict is going to happen. Like, again, people are hard, right? And there's really kind of like two perspectives you can kind of fall into, where you're going to avoid conflict at all costs, or you're going to win at all costs. And conflict is difficult, and we just kind of get in these mindsets. And so we'll sit down in discipleship, and they'll be like, hey, this is what's going on. Like, this is the deal. This is who I'm frustrated with. This is how they're behaving. And my question and your question as you disciple people should really be the same. And it should go like this. Cool, what's your part? Because that other person isn't in the room. And you're not discipling that other person. And your job is not to just make a gossip circle where we recruit people into our belief structure and be like, oh man, like I can't believe they did that. Let's go beat them up. No, we actually need to be together pressing into the image that God has for us. And what that looks like in those moments is, hey, I get it. That sounds hard. What's your part? Like, what are you supposed to do? How are you supposed to respond? What are the ways that you responded that maybe aren't in line with who you say you are and who you believe you are in Christ? The point is that you and I, before we can ever address the speck, we need to address the log. And Jesus says it like this. He says, you hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And I'm one of those weirdos who, like, when Jesus takes the boxing gloves off, I love it. Like, I love it because he shows me how to win when I get punched in the chest with conviction. Like, he shows me what I need to do to look more like him. And he's like, you hypocrite. And this is really cool just from the standpoint of, like, Jesus has, like, off-the-chart emotional intelligence. Because you see him interact with people, and he knows when they need, like gentle, loving kindness. And he also knows when they need a firm collision with reality. And he's like, hey, like, you hypocrite, you are missing it. Now, I want to be clear. When we talk about owning your part first and looking at, hey, what's going on in here and evaluate what we are doing, that's not to say, and we kind of headed it off with this, that's not to say that we don't have the hard conversation with somebody else. I'm not saying that we don't step into accountability. I'm not saying that we don't do it. He just gives us the order for it. And he said, hey, before you do that, do this. Before you address the situation, before you address their part, address your own part. Address what's going on in here. See, we have this mindset, and I already mentioned it, of win at all costs or avoid at all costs. And the win at all costs we've experienced, right? It's actually why some of us do avoid at all costs, because we're like, hey, I know what happens when someone lashes out at me. Like, I know what happens when they act that way and don't look like Jesus and talk down at me or send me those anonymous emails or whatever it is, and we're just like, I know how that feels. And I don't want that, and so I'm just going to push it under the rug, and I'm going to push it under the rug, and I'm pushing it under the rug. See, we know the cost of winning at all costs. We know what that perspective can do when someone just kind of dominates the conversation, but some of us use that to justify the avoid at all costs. And that's actually where we're going to set up camp in a minute, because we need to understand that when we push things under the rug and then we trip over the rug 3 years later because there's a mound there now, that we have a part in that. Because conflict is actually something we're supposed to press into and not be afraid of. Why? Because Jesus does some of his best work in conflict. Like, at no point does Jesus say, hey, it's going to be easy, avoid conflict always. In fact, I know, like, one of the things that he says is like, hey, if we follow him, the world's going to hate us. If we follow him, there will be conflict. There will be difficult. There will be hard things that we have to navigate. The question isn't whether it comes. It's how we respond and how we handle it. And we cannot, listen, as a church, we cannot avoid conflict. We have to be willing to step into it. And here's why. I want you to imagine with me that there is a pool to the left of the stage. Like, there's a pool over here, and I'm ready to go. Like, if you know me, I'm not a beach guy. Like, I don't like sand or salt or water or the sun. But my wife loves it, so we'll go with this. And so there's a pool over here, and the pool is filled, for whatever reason, with sharks with lasers on their heads, because I'm a child. And so I'm like, you know what? As badly as I wanted to go swimming today, I don't want to be lunch, and so I'm not going to do that. And then Steve, your buddy, shows up, and he's good to go. You know, he's got the floaty on, he's got the flippers, he's got the snorkel, his swim trunks are good to go, and he greets you, and he sprints over to the pool. And you know what's about to happen. You're like, they are about to cook him with those lasers and then have a fine dining experience with Steve. So you're like, man, like, I don't want my friend to be hurt. Like, I don't want this to go the way that I know it's going to go. And so you're like, man, like, there's some things that I got to say. Like, I got to let him know. And you would say something. But if you do, maybe he'll be embarrassed. You know, like maybe he'll be embarrassed because you corrected him and it was like this public thing because you have to shout, and you don't want to do that. And and you would bring it up, but like, you also don't know how he's going to react. Like what's Steve going to do? Like, are we still going to be friends after I correct him? Like, that doesn't seem super cool. And maybe he knows about the sharks. Maybe he's just good with it. He's the shark whisperer. He's good to go. And so you're just like, maybe that's fine. And at the end of the day, you justify it, right? Judge not lest ye be judged. And you're like, okay, you know what? It's not my part to correct Steve. And so you let him go in. I don't need to tell you how this story ends. These were not sharks from Finding Nemo. Steve is gone. Why? Because you didn't say anything. And we're like, yeah, that's cool and all, but like, isn't that a little extreme? Like, if it was that, like sharks, lasers in their head, come on, Josh. Like if that were the situation, obviously I'd have the courage to say something. I would address it. I mean, smaller things maybe not. Like if they're in an unhealthy relationship or they're not like really pursuing their spouse the way that they should, or they're straying from their relationship. But smaller things. But those aren't sharks. Those aren't a big deal. And that's the lie we tell ourselves. As we see our brothers and sisters straying, and we avoid conflict and we remain silent, because we don't want to correct our friend. See, when it comes to secret sin and internal conflict and really any issue that could come up, those are all sharks. Those are all sharks that we're allowing our brothers and sisters step into because we're too afraid to say the words we need to say. Now listen, we have a rule in how we say it. The goal isn't judgment where we say, I'm better than you. The goal is like, man, like I want for us to be holy, and part of us being holy is for us to kind of bear each other up. And there's there's sharks in there. The truth is, friends don't let friends swim in a shark tank. And yet we do it all the time. Solomon, the wisest man in history other than Jesus, says it this way. It's one of my favorite verses of all time. It's Proverbs 27:6. Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. And what he's saying here is he's saying, listen, it is the true friend that says, hey man, that's a shark tank. It's the real friend who's like, I love you enough to risk for you. I love you enough to risk an argument because I care about you. I'm seeing this area in your life where you're drifting and you're straying, and I'm seeing this secret sin that I kind of stumbled upon one time, and you're keeping it hidden, acting like it doesn't affect your other relationships. And let me tell you, that's exactly what sin does. And I'm watching you step away from your relationship with Jesus, and your fellowship isn't what it used to be, and you're not pressed into community in the way that God has called us. I see it, and we need to be willing to have the hard conversation. It's saying, hey, wounds from a friend can be trusted. When a friend comes to me and shares an issue that is going on with me, and they've dealt with the log in their eye first, so they really actually, the goal is for us to be holy. The goal is that they're fighting for a relationship. The goal is for us to look more and more like Jesus. Now, it doesn't mean that we automatically just agree with what everybody says. I'm not saying that. But we do need to give them space to speak, because a wound from a friend can be trusted. There's a reason that they felt the need to have that conversation. What I'm not saying is that you should see a stranger doing something weird on the side of the road and go let them know how they're sinners. Right? Like what I am saying is we're in relationship with people. It's why we do life group. Right, so that we can press into authentic community together, grow together, and also have conversations about what it looks like to look more like Jesus. And sometimes that's going to be like, man, I got in an argument with my wife yesterday, and I looked nothing like Jesus. And oh, cool, let's unpack it. What's your part? Sometimes it's going to look like, man, like I'm really struggling in this area of work. I don't know how to look like Jesus in this environment. All right, cool, let's talk about it. Let's press in. Sometimes it's going to be, hey, I see this going on in your life, and I love you enough to say something, because friends don't let friends swim in shark tanks. I'm going to fight for relationship, not just in relationship. But an enemy multiplies kisses, and that's what avoiding is. Let me tell you, like, I'm not Steve's friend if I let him jump in that tank. I'm not. Why? Because a loving friend's going to say something. Y'all, accountability is good. Now, don't weaponize it. Like, don't leave here and just start like beating people over the head with scripture. Leave here knowing that it's our job to love people well, and part of loving people well is having the conversations. It's about sitting in discipleship meetings and being willing to say, listen, I love you enough to say you are missing it. Listen, if your discipleship looks like you just nodding your head, you're doing it wrong. That's not how Jesus did it. We're meant to be growing together, having the hard conversations and speaking truth. Now, there's also a truth in it's not all you on the assertive side of conflict. Sometimes you're on the receiving end. You know what I mean? Like sometimes people are going to bring things to you. And here's the deal. It is our responsibility, it's my responsibility, that when conflict is brought to me, that I prove myself trustworthy in that. Actually, one of the key ways to build a trusting culture in any environment is not how you bring conflict to other people, it's how when it's brought to you, how you receive it. It's for me saying, hey, I'm willing to listen, I'm willing to understand, and I'm rather than me just trying to seek to be understood, I'm willing to actually try to understand what you have going on and why you felt the need to bring this to me. There's a couple principles, a couple questions that I want you to wrestle through as we kind of navigate this, because I really think that we need to internalize this a little bit, and I definitely do. And here are some of the questions. The first one is, do I react or do I respond? And there's a difference. See, reaction is not really about intentionality. Reaction is about how I feel, and here's the tough part. Feelings lie. Like, there are a lot of us here who felt like you should marry that person in 9th grade. You were wrong. Right? Like feelings lie to us, and we just need to recognize the reality of like the way that I feel in this moment might be deceptive, might be a log where I can't see clearly, and if I address that, then maybe I'll be able to respond appropriately. Paul says it this way in Ephesians 4:26. He says, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. And there's some important stuff here because we have this idea that anger is a bad thing, and actually anger has nothing to do with sin. Like anger is not sinful at all. We know this because God at times has been angry. The point is that our anger is not meant to lead us into sin. We're not meant to react in a way that we respond or actually react sinfully. Part of discipling our daughter is we've created some anchor statements. It's just these biblical phrases that we've simplified a little bit to make it just memorable for a 3-year-old. I mean, she's 6 now, but we've still got these phrases that we go back to because we wanted her to be able to understand truth at its core. And one of them is based off of this passage. And it goes like this. It's okay to be mad. It's not okay to be mean. It's that simple. It's a phrase that she knows. Why? Because she needs to understand anger is not necessarily a bad thing. There are times where you and we're actually supposed to be angry. The point is that we're not supposed to sin in that anger. And then it continues, do not let the sun go down on your sin. And we, young and marrieds, I'm about to help you out a lot because this means something very different than a lot of times how we translate it. Because sometimes we'll be like, this is early on in our marriage, we're like, hey, if we get in an argument at 11 p.m., we're going to be up till 3 a.m. We're dealing with this. That's a recipe for making a small conflict a not small conflict. What this is talking about is something very different. Actually, Paul in Ephesians, he's quoting David. He's quoting David in Psalm 4:4, where David says really the exact same thing. He says, in your anger, do not sin. When you are in bed, search your heart. What he's saying, hey, we need to take some time to reflect and be intentional. We need to sometimes, because feelings lie, be able to step away from the conflict and really understand what is going on in our hearts and the lies that we are choosing to believe. And Paul takes it a step further, and he says, also, don't let the sun go down on your anger that the devil cannot have a foothold. What he's saying is, yes, take time to reflect, but don't let it linger. He's saying, take time to reflect. Sometimes you need to just get in bed and just think through your part. Sometimes I need to just sit down and just wrestle with the Lord about what my part is, and that's good, and that's biblical, and also it's going to lead into action where we're going to have the conversation. Jenny and I, because when we were first married, we were not good at fighting. We had to create some rules of engagement. And one of the rules of engagement was like, hey, at any point in time, in any conflict we were having, we could just pump the brakes. One of us was allowed to say, hey, I need a break. Now, it wasn't allowed to be a weapon. It wasn't allowed to be like, hey, you need a break. Right? We did that a couple times. It doesn't go over so well. But hey, I need a break. And the rule was we would take 10 minutes, and the only thing we were allowed to do, we'd go into different rooms, and we were allowed to pray, and we were allowed to read scripture, and that was it. we never had a conflict persist after that. Like, as soon as we sought the Lord, we would come back and we would own our parts. Like, it was that simple. But what we had to do is we had to stop the reacting. Like, it's part of being a kid is like learning how to regulate emotions. Like, that's a big piece of it. And part of being an adult is we don't know how to regulate our emotions. And we need to just recognize that sometimes we need to step back and say, all right, you know what? The way I'm reacting because I'm believing lies, I need to step back and say, okay, I want to respond intentionally. I'm not going to let my anger lead me to sin. In fact, I'm going to actually use this conflict not to be drawn away from each other, but in my marriage or whatever conflict relationship it is, to be drawn closer together. Because here's the deal. When there's three parts in every relationship, the closest that we could be to each other, if it's a triangle, my part, your part, God's part, the closest we can be is if we're both moving towards God. If we are both pressing in and choosing to respond, Jesus can use that conflict and turn it around to something that you can be grateful for. Next question is, and I'm almost done, I promise. Do I listen to understand or do I listen to debate? You guys ever do that? Where you're listening. In fact, you're hanging on to every word because as soon as they breathe, you're going to mess them up. Right? You're like, I know everything you just said. And Jenny's like, you're keeping a list? Like, are you writing this down? Like, what's happening? And it's because we're listening just because we want to be able to react to it. Like, hey, listen, okay, you said that. I know how to counter that. You said that. All right, okay, now there's three things I need to list. We're like, hey, I'm going to debate you in this. And we're missing it, man. Like, we have to deal with the log first. Are you listening to understand, or are you just trying to be understood? We need to fight for relationship and not in relationship. And the last one is a question, but honestly, it's a tool that we should be taking away, is do I remain curious? Like, in the middle of the conflict, am I choosing to ask intentional questions? Am I choosing to try to clarify and understand, hey, where's this coming from? Okay, I don't fully understand that. And rather than just debating it and saying, hey, that sounds real dumb right now, try to actually get clarity and understand, okay, but this has clearly tweaked you. I want to own my part. I just don't fully understand. Help me to understand. We need to remain curious. Listen, like, as a church, we are going to step forward together onto the field. But what a team doesn't do is a team doesn't let a team member keep tripping. You know, like, if I'm on your team and I'm not running the right route, and so the quarterback's always throwing interceptions because I'm not where I'm supposed to be, or maybe I'm just constantly missing a block, a team doesn't go, you know what, we're just not going to address it right now. A team member is going to say, hey, hold on, you're missing it. And I care about you enough, and I also care about this team enough for us to walk together on this mission as we score points for the King. You and I, we need to respond, not react. We need to listen to understand, and we need to remain curious. And if we can do those things, the way we handle conflict is going to edify the body. It's going to look like Jesus, and Jesus is going to do work in here. We're going to take a song. And in this song, we're going to have the chance to respond together. And in this response, what I really want you to do, because what I don't want to have happen is, like, you stand up and we start worshiping and you start thinking about conflict and about how, oh man, I need to address these things and these other people. We're not going to worry about that right now. We're going to deal with logs first. So here's my ask, is during this song of worship, I want you to think about that relationship that as soon as I mentioned conflict came to mind. And I want you to think about what your part is. And maybe that relationship isn't a person, but it's with God. And if that's the case, one, that's awesome. Seek his forgiveness. Press in with him as he changes us and works in us. We're going to take this song. We're going to have prayer partners up front if you need prayer. But remember, the goal is let's own our part. Jesus, you are so good. And mirrors are not always our favorite thing. Because we look in the mirror and we see the things that have blinded us. I know that you're calling us to take it out first, but sometimes it hurts, Lord. And I just pray that you give us a courage and a willingness to step into the hard, a courage and a willingness to deal with our part first, as then we are able to shepherd others well. Pray that any conflict we step into is about us being holy and not about the issue in that one person, that we are able to just step closer to who you call us to be. God, you are good, and we praise you. Amen. Please stand.